For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Shannon Derehove. Author Heidi Holland joins me to discuss her new book, 100 Years of Struggle, Mandela's ANC. You first wrote a book on the history of the ANC in the late 1980s. What inspired you to bring out a new edition, and what insight does this new edition bring?
Well, first of all, it's the ANC centenary this year, so that's an obvious time for reflection. And also it's an important year in any case, because the ANC is choosing its next set of leaders at the end of this year. So a lot of happening in respect to the ANC this year, but also this liberation movement that became the government of the country is in a state of flux at the moment, and I think there is a lot of interest in the ANC and sort of what's gone wrong. Not that everything has gone wrong, a lot has gone right, but you know, my feeling was that in order to reflect on the ANC and government, one really needs to see it in its entirety throughout its history, because it wasn't, of course, trained or set up as a government. It was set up as a liberation movement, and that's part of what we're grappling with as a country, is that the state is a former liberation movement with quite a lot of handicaps as a result.
Your book focuses on leadership, in particular facilitating a comparison of the different generations of ANC leaders. What lessons do you draw?
Well, the ANC has had a lot of leaders, some of whom have been good, and some of whom have been bad, and some of whom have been indifferent. And although that sounds very obvious, I mean, I think it is a bit the luck of the draw. I think we're in a period of bad leadership at the moment, and that goes back, I think, to the fact that a liberation movement has become the governing party in a very complicated society. And isn't faring very well, whether you look at Thabo Mbeki or at Jacob Zuma. Madiba, of course, Nelson Mandela, was an extraordinary leader for a number of reasons. He wasn't necessarily hands-on a great leader, because Mbeki really did a lot of the administrative stuff that was very, very complicated in moving from a police state under apartheid to a democracy under Madiba. A lot of the nuts and bolts work was done by Mbeki, and done pretty well by Mbeki. But Thabo Mbeki was a very autocratic leader. Again, that was a reflection of the years in exile, when there was a lot of paranoia, there was a lot of infighting. The ANC came to power as a pretty flawed organisation. You know, many of us had high hopes for the ANC when they came back from exile, and there was a lot of mythology around the ANC. I think there was this idea that this remarkable man called Nelson Mandela could absolve us from sin, which was sort of a rather naive. The entire world bought into that, in fact. And there was also an idea that the ANC so deserved, you know, to finally conquer apartheid, and that everything would be absolutely hunky-dory. Well, of course, hasn't been quite like that. And so part of my reason for writing this book in a different form is so that as we reflect on the ANC, and as we are increasingly critical of the ANC as pundits and as citizens, we know what we're talking about. I mean, 100 years is a long time, and a lot has happened in that time. So reflecting back on the leadership, there have been all sorts of leaders. Some of the early leaders in the 40s, for example, you had Dr. Albert Zuma, spelled X-U-M-A rather than Z-U-M-A, who was of course a herd boy, but he had been to Princeton and he'd been to Oxford. A very, very clever guy who married a sophisticated American woman. And although he did a lot for the ANC, and he certainly in terms of organisation, he couldn't really relate to the majority of the ANC's members. He himself was sort of more sophisticated than his own membership, you know. And then, of course, one had Nelson Mandela as a young man in the Youth League, which we hear a lot about from Julius Malema, so, some of which is accurate. A lot of it is accurate, in fact, though, of course, Julius Malema himself probably has more in common with Winnie Mandela than he does with Nelson Mandela, though he likes to compare himself to Nelson Mandela. And Mandela was a good leader. He became sort of deified virtually in prison, which was a branding campaign, very successful branding campaign that the ANC conducted, in fact, while Nelson Mandela was in prison. When he came out, he was well able to live up to the reputation that he had gained while in prison. But that was a very, very successful public relations spin campaign, though he was a good leader. So leadership is a multiple feast, you know. It's I'd say the ANC's had some exemplary leaders, and all we really need is one more good leader. And I mean, I'm very relieved to hear that Motlanthe is standing against Jacob Zuma. It's reassuring to me, at any rate, to see somebody like Cyril Ramaphosa, who's kept his head below the parapet so much for so long, seeming to come out and say things in the open a bit more. You know, I think the culture in the ANC has changed a lot. It's not as open an organisation as it used to be.
On leadership again, you suggest that President Jacob Zuma is a shrewd politician but not a leader. How do you substantiate this view?
Well, you know, the problem with Zuma is I don't think we're seeing him at his best, because he came to power so compromised. You know, he had fraud charges hanging over his head. He had led a campaign against Mbeki, unseating Mbeki in a very crude and cruel, actually, manner at Polokwane. He then set about making the charges that he ought to have faced in court go away by manipulating the judiciary. You know, these were portents that we knew at the time were going to play out very badly for our democracy. So I don't think Jacob Zuma has the time to lead the country. I think that's the least of his problems. I think his problems are so manifest, keeping this uneasy alliance, three-pronged alliance together, keeping his own ghost, if you like, at bay. He's had to deal with Julius Malema, which really was an extremely difficult problem, since he had created Malema in the first place to help him with no foresight into what that might imply, and then had to call him to heel, which as we've all seen hasn't been easy. So my feeling is that Zuma, he surrounds himself with leaders with whom he feels comfortable. He's an ill-educated man, and generally speaking, not entirely, but he has tended to pick advisors who are equally ill prepared for the complex business of governing a complex society. And so, you know, I think this is one of the prices that one pays for populist rule. But in Jacob Zuma's case, the man seems completely preoccupied with his own career, and I think the longer he's there, the more obvious that becomes. It does look as though he will be coming in for another term, which I think is a great pity. But all it takes is, as I said, you know, one turn of events, and let's hope it's not another Polokwane, a recalling of the leadership, which I don't think is a democratically very beneficial. It shows a great intolerance if you can't even let a sitting president complete his term by a few months. You know, it's not a good precedent, and already people like Malema are saying that the same thing is going to happen in December this year. Now, of course, we're none of us taking too much notice any longer of what Malema says, but it has set a precedent, unfortunately, and it is possible.
On Julius Malema, you suggest that he uses references to the past to compensate for poor governance. You also suggest that he represents an anarchistic onslaught on the ANC. How do you think the ANC can resolve the Julius Malema problem?
Well, theoretically, the ANC has resolved the Julius Malema problem. I mean, they've kicked him out of the ANC. He's no longer a member of the ANC. I don't think it's necessarily the problem of one individual. The problem is that he has exposed some political terrain that that is quite legitimate, and that is the poor. The inequality in the country is its biggest problem, and has been for a long time and will remain so. The ANC doesn't appear to know how to deal with that. COSATU, which used to be as much of a human rights organization under apartheid as a trade union movement, has become really exclusively a trade union movement. It's only actually interested in its workers. As much as Vavi seems to be the voice in the wilderness, you know, saying morally correct things, if you really look at what Vavi's saying, he's only actually representing employed people. Therefore, unemployed people who are the real poor are not actually represented, except by the Communist Party, who have a lot of influence, but numerically aren't very strong or relevant. So Malema speaks on behalf of the poor. The big problem with Malema is his hypocrisy. He speaks for the poor, but he lives like the rich, so he himself is a very flawed individual. But that doesn't mean that political space won't be occupied by others, and you never know. Again, one might get genuinely well-meaning people occupying that space, in which case the landscape, the political landscape here will change dramatically.
You argue that the struggle is far from over because in spite of defeating the apartheid machine, the ANC has still not managed to create a better life for all. Can you comment on this?
Well, the whole purpose of the struggle, obviously, and as was articulated by all its leaders throughout the 100 years of its existence, was to make a better life for all. It was to end inequality, to educate people, to bring about black economic empowerment. And in fact, we haven't really, considering it's nearly 20 years since apartheid ended, well, 17 years anyway, we haven't made all that much progress, certainly not in education, which, when you think about it, is the most effective means of empowerment. Black economic empowerment, as BEE, as the economic policy that Mbeki and Madiba put in place, was a good thing because it brought about a small middle class very quickly, but a much more effective means of empowering black people or unempowered people is through education, which the government seems to have no political will on at all. So I would say, just on those measures, education, health has gone backwards. The state isn't doing very well, and in fact that is beginning to show, I think, in the attitude of the general public towards the ANC. Of course, there are not many options in terms of voting against the ANC. So for some time the ANC has it all its own way, and is effectively a one-party state. It's beginning to show signs of arrogance in the face of that unfettered power. For example, its attitude, hostile attitude towards the media is very worrying, and its attempts to manipulate the judiciary are really quite scary. So once again, the main purpose of the ANC's existence seems to have been put on the back burner, while there looks like an increasing attempt to consolidate power in a situation which the ANC knows is not ideal from the perspective of the poor and the majority of the people. I mean, some people say that the fact that we have a quarter of our population on social grants today, which seems to me to be quite an extraordinary achievement, some people will say cynically that the ANC has done this in order to have 15% of the population voting for it, regardless of its performance, you know, and that is extremely cynical. But when you have a good look at those social grants, which cost the country a huge amount of money, there seems very little attempt to engender different behavior from the people who are receiving the grants. For example, in a country like Brazil, a lot of poor people are on grants, quite rightly, but they are required in exchange for their grants to send their children to school. They are required to look for jobs. They're required, you know, there's certain behaviors that are mandatory if you are the recipient of a grant. In our case, there seems to be no follow-up in respect of behavior change among the poor, and so it's a little bit ill thought out, you know. So yes, we have made some progress, definitely. The fact that 50 million people are on social grant is a huge achievement, whereas under apartheid all we had was an old age pension. That was the only thing that existed. But it's not necessarily as constructive as it looks if it's not engendering through education, A, and through some reciprocal behavior, B, progress, you know, towards a better life for all and a sustainable life for all.
Well, thank you very much for your insights, and I wish you all the best for the future.
Thank you.